Do you seriously think someone like you can demand anything here? Sit down, shut up, and be grateful we're even listening to you." The officer's voice dripped with disdain, his words slicing through the tense air of the police station like shards of glass. The woman stood her ground, her gaze steady despite the humiliation swelling in her chest. She wasn't there to argue, only to report a theft, but the hostility had come unprovoked. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice calm yet firm, her dignity fighting against the searing indignity of the moment. But he wasn't done. With a smirk that radiated malice, the officer grabbed his steaming cup of coffee, tilted it slightly in his hand, and with a deliberate motion, threw it across the desk. The liquid splashed across her face, the scalding heat burning her skin, but it was the coldness in his actions that struck deeper. Gasps echoed from the few witnesses in the station, some shocked, others complicit in their silence. "Consider it a reminder of where you stand," he spat, his tone saturated with authority and prejudice. She stumbled back slightly, her mind spinning not just from the pain but the sheer audacity of what had just happened. Her face stung, her pride bruised, and yet, she refused to break. There was too much at stake for her to crumble here. The officer leaned back, smug in his assumed victory, unaware that the woman he had just assaulted was no ordinary civilian. In fact, she was far from it. And soon, he, and everyone else in that station, would realize just how colossal his mistake had been. For weeks, the department had buzzed with rumors of a new chief of police, someone who was going to shake things up. No one expected that person to be a woman, much less a black woman, and least of all, the very woman now standing in the middle of the station, coffee dripping from her chin. The officer had unwittingly targeted his soon-to-be superior in a display of arrogance that would mark the beginning of his undoing. But what made this confrontation inevitable? Why had she walked into the station that day without revealing her position, and what vendetta had led the officer to act with such overt hostility? And most importantly, what was going to happen next? As the minutes ticked by, the station began to shift. The air grew heavier, tension bubbling beneath the surface as whispers spread about what had just occurred. The woman, still composed despite the humiliation, disappeared into the back office with a silent, knowing expression that sent a chill through the room. It was as if she was planning something, a reckoning none of them were prepared for. The officer's confidence started to waver when an unexpected figure arrived at the precinct, a high-ranking official who locked eyes with the woman and immediately offered her the respect she deserved. Questions buzzed around the station. Who was she, and why was someone so powerful treating her with such reverence? Slowly, the truth began to unravel, and with it, the officer's smug facade. What followed was a series of events that left everyone in shock, from the lowest-ranking clerk to the most seasoned detective. By the time the truth was fully revealed, the tables had turned so dramatically that even those who had initially sided with the officer couldn't help but feel the weight of justice bearing down. This wasn't just a story about one man's bigotry or one woman's resolve. It was about something much larger, the cracks in a system, the courage to confront injustice, and the consequences of underestimating the wrong person. What could drive a man to such blatant cruelty, and what kind of justice awaits him for his actions? Stay with us as we unfold a story of humiliation, resilience, and a reckoning so powerful it will leave you speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To every black viewer watching this story, know that you are seen, valued, and deserving of respect. Our channel is committed to telling stories that challenge injustice and highlight resilience. Thank you for being here, and if you enjoy stories with powerful twists and meaningful messages, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back, and enjoy this impactful tale. In the heart of Atlanta, where the hum of the city mixed with the rhythmic pulse of determination, Danielle Warren stood as a testament to resilience. Danielle, a tall, commanding woman in her late 30s, carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of pushing through barriers others had placed before her. Her caramel-brown skin glowed under the city lights, and her sharp eyes reflected both warmth and an unyielding strength. She wasn't just a woman who had climbed the ranks in law enforcement, she was a survivor of countless battles fought against prejudice, sexism, and systemic resistance. Danielle had grown up in the neighborhood of Mechanicsville, a place where dreams often collided with harsh realities. Raised by her grandmother, Evelyn, a fiery civil rights activist, Danielle had learned from an early age that standing up for herself and others wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Evelyn's lessons echoed in her life every day: respect isn't given to us, Danny. It's taken, fought for, and earned. And even then, some will refuse to see it. Determined to change a system that had so often failed her community, Danielle had worked her way through the ranks of the police force with an unshakable resolve. She studied harder, worked longer, and kept her composure in the face of provocation. By the time she earned the opportunity to lead, she had seen every layer of the system, from the streets where beat cops enforced rules unevenly, to the offices where decisions were made behind closed doors. Her vision was clear: reform the system from within, even if it meant enduring the kind of scrutiny and resistance that most would shy away from. As Danielle prepared to step into her new role as chief of police, she knew the weight of what it meant. She wasn't just walking into a position of authority, she was carrying the expectations of an entire community that had been overlooked and dismissed for decades. But Danielle didn't let herself get lost in the symbolism of her achievement. To her, the title wasn't the goal, it was a tool to create meaningful change. Meanwhile, in the precinct Danielle would soon lead, Officer Brad Marshall represented the kind of complacency and entitlement that Danielle had spent her career fighting against. In his early 40s, Brad had built his career not on merit, but on relationships and unspoken privileges. He was the kind of officer who saw the badge as a shield for his behavior rather than a responsibility. With short-cropped blonde hair, a squared jaw, and a constant air of superiority, Brad had long believed he was untouchable. Brad's record was a patchwork of commendations and complaints. His superiors often turned a blind eye to his casual racism and abrasive behavior, chalking it up to his old-school approach to policing. He had a way of intimidating colleagues into silence and manipulating situations to his advantage. To him, respect wasn't earned, it was demanded. And when it wasn't freely given, he took it by force. Brad's disdain for anyone who challenged his authority was well known, and his behavior towards civilians of color was particularly troubling. In his mind, respect for the police was non-negotiable, and anyone who questioned him was an enemy. It didn't matter whether the challenge was polite or confrontational, he saw both as a threat to his fragile ego. Brad's interactions at the precinct were a cocktail of arrogance and condescension, and though some of his colleagues grumbled privately about his behavior, few dared to confront him outright. The precinct itself was a microcosm of the city it served. Situated in a diverse part of Atlanta, it handled everything from routine patrols to high-stakes investigations. The building buzzed with activity at all hours, its walls a patchwork of history, faded plaques commemorating past officers, bulletin boards crowded with notices, and the hum of radios crackling in the background. It was a place where tension simmered beneath the surface, both among the officers and the community they served. On the day that Danielle walked into the precinct unannounced, she had dressed deliberately in plain clothes. She wanted to observe without the weight of her title influencing behavior. It was a strategic choice, one rooted in years of experience. Danielle knew that how people acted when they thought no one important was watching revealed their true character. She had entered the building with a simple purpose: to gauge the environment and see firsthand what needed to change. She carried with her the humility of someone who had walked these halls before, just not in this capacity. But as she approached the front desk, the reaction she received wasn't one of professionalism or welcome. Brad was stationed there, leaning back in his chair with a casual arrogance. When Danielle asked for assistance, he barely looked up. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone laced with irritation. "I need to report a theft," she replied, her voice steady. Brad's smirk widened. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Danielle didn't flinch. "Excuse me," she said, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "What's the problem? Another purse stolen?" "Some phone you lost," he said, rolling his eyes. You people always think we're here to play babysitter. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. I'd like to file a report, she said firmly. Brad leaned forward, his smirk turning into a sneer. And I'd like you to learn how to stay in your lane. But we can't always get what we want, can we? Before Danielle could respond, Brad reached for his coffee mug. His actions were deliberate, calculated, a show of dominance rather than an impulsive act. He threw the steaming liquid toward her, and though she turned her head in time to avoid the worst of it, the coffee splashed across her cheek and neck. The heat bit at her skin, but it was the humiliation that burned deeper. The room went silent. A few officers turned away, unwilling to intervene. Others watched, their faces a mixture of shock and discomfort. But Danielle stood tall, her composure unbroken despite the sting on her skin. Consider that a lesson in respect, Brad said, leaning back in his chair with satisfaction. Danielle's gaze locked onto his, unyielding. Respect, she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made the word feel like a warning. As she turned and walked toward the back of the precinct, the tension in the room was palpable. No one knew who she was, but everyone sensed that something significant had just occurred. For Brad, it was just another day of asserting his authority. For Danielle, it was the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the precinct, and Brad's life, to its core. The precinct buzzed with its usual hum of activity, but under the surface, tension brewed like a storm on the horizon. Officer Brad Marshall leaned against his desk, chuckling with his usual group of cronies, oblivious to the subtle but growing unease around him. The incident with the woman, Danielle, barely registered as significant in his mind. For him, it was just another reminder of his self-proclaimed dominance. He had done worse before and faced nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Why would this time be any different? But in the background, ripples of unease were spreading. Who was she? Whispered Officer Green to his partner, Officer Morales, as they huddled near the coffee station. Green was new to the precinct, still learning the unspoken rules and alliances. I don't know, Morales replied, glancing over his shoulder to ensure Brad couldn't hear. But she wasn't just some random civilian. Did you see how she handled it? No screaming, no threats. That kind of composure. I don't know, man. She's somebody. Across the precinct, Danielle sat in a temporary office, her presence quiet yet commanding. She had changed out of her coffee-stained clothes and now wore a crisp blazer that seemed to emphasize her authority even without her saying a word. In front of her was a list of names, each one representing an officer under her command. Her eyes scanned the list with methodical precision, mentally cataloging details she had already begun to observe. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Captain Richards, a seasoned officer in his late 50s with a gruff demeanor but a genuine sense of justice. Chief, he began, his voice low but respectful. Words getting around that something happened out there earlier. You want me to address it? Danielle looked up, her expression unreadable. No, she said simply. Not yet. Richards hesitated. With all due respect, if this is about Marshall, it is, Danielle interrupted, her tone calm but firm. And it will be handled. But not by you. Richards nodded, sensing the finality in her words. As he left, Danielle leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had seen men like Brad Marshall before, arrogant, entitled, and protected by a culture that allowed their behavior to persist. But what he didn't know was that his actions had set something in motion far beyond his control. Back in the bullpen, Brad noticed the growing whispers but dismissed them as the usual office gossip. He was more interested in planning his weekend than worrying about consequences. As he leaned back in his chair, Officer Green approached cautiously. Hey, Brad, Green began, his voice hesitant. That woman from earlier, you know anything about her? Brad snorted. What's there to know? Another loudmouth thinking she can walk in here and make demands. Green frowned. Yeah, but, she didn't seem like the usual. Something about her felt different. Brad rolled his eyes. Jesus, Green, don't tell me you're scared. These people love to act tough, but they don't have the guts to follow through. Trust me, she's already forgotten about it. But Green wasn't convinced, and he wasn't alone. Other officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that Brad's bravado was masking a growing uncertainty. As the day progressed, the tension in the precinct thickened. Officers noticed subtle changes: a visiting group of officials conducting routine evaluations, whispered conversations among higher-ups, and an unusual number of closed-door meetings. Brad, oblivious as ever, chalked it up to bureaucracy. It wasn't until the following morning that things began to unravel. As Brad strolled into the precinct with his usual swagger, he was met with a series of stares that he couldn't ignore. Even his closest allies seemed unusually quiet. What the hell's going on? He muttered as he dropped his bag onto his desk. No one answered. Minutes later, Captain Richard stepped out of his office and called for a meeting in the conference room. The officers filed in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Brad took a seat near the back, his arms crossed defiantly. When Danielle entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. She wasn't dressed like the woman Brad had humiliated the day before. Today, she wore her full uniform, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The room fell silent as she took her place at the head of the table. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but authoritative. "For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Danielle Warren. I'm your new chief of police." The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Brad's smug grin vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion and then disbelief. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the realization dawning on him far too late. Danielle's gaze swept across the room, her expression unyielding. "I've spent the past few days observing this precinct, and let me be clear, I'm here to make changes. Changes that will ensure this department operates with integrity, respect, and accountability." Her words hung in the air, each one a direct challenge to the culture Brad had thrived in for years. He clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing with how to spin this in his favor. But Danielle wasn't done. She turned her attention directly to him. "Officer Marshall," she said, her tone steady but sharp. "A word." The room buzzed with silent anticipation as Brad followed her out, his usual bravado replaced by a forced calm. In her office, Danielle closed the door and motioned for him to sit. He remained standing. "Look," he began, his voice defensive. "If this is about yesterday, it is," Danielle interrupted, her tone icy. "Sit down." Brad hesitated before reluctantly taking a seat. Danielle leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "What you did yesterday wasn't just unprofessional, it was a violation of everything this badge stands for. You don't have the authority to degrade or harm anyone who walks through these doors. Not yesterday, not ever." Brad smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been here long enough to know how things work, Chief. People like me don't go down over misunderstandings." Danielle's expression didn't waver. "You're right," she said, her voice deadly calm. "People like you don't go down over misunderstandings. They go down over patterns. And I've already started digging into yours." Brad's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. Danielle let the silence linger, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I suggest you get comfortable with accountability," she said finally. "Because it's coming, whether you're ready or not." As Brad left the office, the tension in his chest tightened. For the first time, he felt the cracks forming in the foundation of his carefully constructed power. And for the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated the storm that was about to engulf him. The air in the precinct felt charged, like the static before a thunderstorm. Every officer in the building had heard whispers of an impending announcement, but no one knew exactly what it would entail. Officer Brad Marshall, however, sat stiffly at his desk, a thin veneer of confidence barely masking the gnawing unease that had settled in his chest since his confrontation with Chief Danielle Warren. He had spent the night replaying their conversation, her words looping in his mind with a sharpness that left him restless. Brad's attempts to maintain his usual bravado had grown increasingly strained. The sidelong glances from his colleagues, the murmurs that quieted when he entered a room, all told him that something was coming. But what unnerved him most was Danielle herself, her composure, her deliberate choice of words. She wasn't the type to bluff, and he knew it. "Marshal," came a sharp voice, breaking his train of thought. It was Captain Richards, standing at the edge of the bullpen. "Conference room. Now." Brad hesitated, but only for a moment. He stood, straightened his uniform, and made his way to the room, aware of every pair of eyes following his steps. Inside, the table was already crowded with high-ranking officials, including Danielle, who sat at the head, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. Brad took the last empty seat, trying to appear nonchalant. "What's this about?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with forced ease. Danielle didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slid a folder across the table toward him. The room fell silent as Brad opened it. Inside were reports, detailed, damning, and impossible to ignore. Complaints filed against him over the years, incidents swept under the rug, testimonies from civilians and even fellow officers. Each page felt heavier than the last, the weight of his actions compiled in black and white. "This," Danielle began, her voice steady but cutting, "is your record, Officer Marshall. A record that paints a clear picture of someone who has consistently abused their position, disregarded protocol, and failed to uphold the values of this department." Brad's face flushed. "These are old complaints," he said quickly, his voice rising. "Half of this is exaggerated." "None of it," Danielle interrupted, her tone icy, "is exaggerated. And I'm not the only one who sees it." She gestured toward the far end of the table, where a man in a suit sat silently. Brad recognized him immediately, Internal Affairs. His stomach sank. "This is a joke," Brad said, his voice tinged with desperation. "You can't just dig up old grievances and call it evidence. If this is about yesterday, this isn't just about yesterday," Danielle said sharply, her eyes locking onto his. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has no place in this department or this city." Brad's hands gripped the edge of the table. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit in an office and make decisions, but we're the ones on the streets. Sometimes you have to be tough." "Tough?" Danielle repeated, her voice low but laced with steel. "Throwing coffee in someone's face isn't tough. It's cowardice. It's abuse of power. And it's unacceptable." The room was deathly silent. Brad looked around, searching for an ally, but no one met his gaze. Even his usual supporters avoided his eyes, their discomfort evident. For the first time, Brad realized how isolated he truly was. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're all going to let her do this? After everything I've done for this department?" "You mean everything you've done for yourself," Danielle said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "You've built a career on fear and intimidation, not respect. That ends today." Brad stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a setup," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're just trying to make an example out of me." Danielle rose to her feet, her calm demeanor unshaken. "You're right," she said, her voice firm. "You are an example. An example of what happens when we allow individuals like you to operate unchecked. And an example of what happens when accountability finally catches up." At that moment, the man from Internal Affairs spoke for the first time. "Officer Marshall, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. You are to surrender your badge and weapon." Brad's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer with every passing second. Finally, he forced a laugh, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think this is over?" he said, glaring at Danielle. "You think you've won?" Danielle didn't flinch. "This isn't about winning, Brad. It's about doing what's right. Brad's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and placed it on the table, the sound echoing in the silent room. He slammed his weapon down beside it, his jaw clenched tightly. Without another word, he stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The room remained quiet for a moment before Captain Richards spoke. "What now?" Danielle exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. "Now," she said, "we rebuild." But even as the meeting adjourned and the officers dispersed, a question lingered in the air: how far would Brad go to protect the fragile power he had clung to for so long? And what consequences awaited those who dared to hold him accountable? Outside the precinct, Brad sat in his car, his mind racing. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Everything he had built, every corner he had cut, was unraveling before his eyes. And deep down, he knew it was only the beginning. As the precinct settled into an uneasy quiet, Danielle remained in her office, her mind sharp and focused. The confrontation with Brad had been inevitable, but she knew it wasn't the end. Men like him didn't go down quietly, and she had prepared herself for the backlash. What she hadn't anticipated was the ripple effect his suspension would have on the rest of the precinct. The undercurrent of unease was palpable, and Danielle knew she had to act decisively to prevent it from spreading further. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Captain Richards stepped in, his face lined with concern. "Chief," he began, shutting the door behind him. "Marshall's been sitting outside the building for over an hour. He's not causing trouble, yet, but it's unsettling some of the officers." Danielle leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Let him sit," she said after a moment. "He's looking for a reaction. Let's not give him one." Richards hesitated. "You sure that's wise? A man like him, he's unpredictable when cornered." Danielle's gaze was steady. "I'm counting on it." Meanwhile, outside in the parking lot, Brad's anger simmered beneath the surface. He sat behind the wheel of his car, staring at the precinct doors with a mixture of bitterness and defiance. His thoughts raced, a chaotic swirl of humiliation, rage, and fear. He had always seen himself as untouchable, the kind of officer who could bend the rules without consequence. And now, the one time he had pushed too far, it had come crashing down around him. He reached for his phone and hesitated. His contact list was filled with names, people he had worked with, people who owed him favors, but he wasn't sure who would still stand by him now. His fingers hovered over one name in particular before finally pressing the call button. "Yeah," a voice answered after a few rings, gruff and impatient. "It's Marshall," Brad said, his tone clipped. "I need to talk." "About what?" "You know damn well about what," Brad snapped. "Warren's out for blood. She's digging through my record, and I know there's stuff in there that could cause problems for you too." There was a pause on the other end. "You're the one who got sloppy, Brad. Don't drag me into your mess. You think she'll stop at me?" Brad countered, his voice rising. "She's making an example out of me now, but once I'm gone, she'll come for the rest of you. You know how these reformers work, they don't stop until the whole system is flipped." The line went silent for a moment before the voice spoke again. "Fine. Meet me tonight. Usual place." Brad hung up, his mind racing. He had a plan now, or at least the beginnings of one. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. Back inside the precinct, Danielle was meeting with a group of trusted officers. Among them were Captain Richards, Officer Morales, and Sergeant Taylor, individuals she had identified as allies in her mission to overhaul the department. Marshall's reaction was predictable, Danielle said, addressing the group. "He's not going to sit quietly and accept this. He's going to push back, and when he does, we need to be ready." "How do you want to handle it, Chief?" Taylor asked, his tone respectful. Danielle leaned forward, her expression firm. "We stay professional. We follow the protocols to the letter. He's hoping to bait us into a mistake, something he can use to discredit us. We won't give him that satisfaction." Morales, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Do you think he's dangerous? Danielle considered the question carefully. Brad's dangerous in the way that all desperate men are. He feels like he's losing everything, and that makes him unpredictable. But we can't let that dictate our actions. We focus on the work, on building the case against him. Let the evidence speak for itself. As the meeting concluded, Danielle felt a pang of exhaustion. The weight of her position was heavy, but she reminded herself why she had taken on this role in the first place. This wasn't just about Brad, it was about creating a system where officers like him couldn't thrive in the first place. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Brad arrived at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where cops and other city workers gathered off the clock, a neutral ground where deals were made, and secrets were kept. He spotted his contact at a booth in the corner and slid into the seat across from him. "Thanks for meeting me," Brad said, his tone tense. "Make it quick," the man replied, his eyes scanning the room. "I don't like being seen with you right now." Brad leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Warren's got IA digging into my record. She's using me to send a message, and if she finds what I think she will, it's not just me who's going down." The man frowned. "What do you want from me?" "Help me get ahead of this," Brad said. "I've got files, documents, emails, stuff that could complicate things for her. But I need access to certain records to make it stick." The man's expression darkened. "You're playing with fire, Brad. If this blows up, it's already blowing up." Brad interrupted, his voice sharp. "This is my career, my life, we're talking about. I'm not going to sit back and let her destroy it." There was a long silence before the man finally nodded. "Fine. But if this goes south, you're on your own." As Brad left the bar, he felt a flicker of confidence return. He wasn't out of the fight yet. Back at the precinct, Danielle reviewed the day's developments. The evidence against Brad was mounting, but she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. She had seen men like him before, men who believed they were above the rules, who saw accountability as a personal attack. But she also knew that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. As she prepared to leave for the night, a thought struck her. Turning to Captain Richards, she said, "Keep an eye on Marshall. He's not the type to go quietly." Richards nodded. "You think he'll try something?" "I'd bet on it," Danielle replied, her tone resolute. "And when he does, we'll be ready." The pieces were in motion, the tension building to a breaking point. Both Danielle and Brad knew that the next move would be critical, and neither was willing to back down. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just their fates, but the future of the precinct itself. The tension in the precinct lingered long after the explosive confrontation. The officers moved through their routines with a cautious energy, their glances shifting toward Danielle's office or the empty desk where Brad Marshall once sat. Conversations were whispered, quick exchanges that fizzled into silence when someone approached. The aftermath of the revelation had left its mark, and the sense of unease was palpable. Danielle remained composed, even as the weight of the situation bore down on her. She understood the dynamics of power at play. Brad's suspension wasn't just about him, but a challenge to a culture that had long operated unchecked. Still, she knew that her actions, though justified, had drawn a line in the sand. Some would see her as a leader bringing long overdue change, others would see her as a threat to the status quo. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Captain Richards. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, his tone urgent. Danielle made her way to Richards' office, where he was seated at his desk, staring at his monitor. He gestured for her to take a look. The screen displayed a grainy security camera feed of the precinct parking lot from the previous night. Brad's car was clearly visible, but it wasn't what caught Danielle's attention. It was the figure approaching the building in the early hours of the morning, moving deliberately and carrying what appeared to be a small package. "Who's that?" Danielle asked, her eyes narrowing. "Not sure yet," Richards replied. But it was left by the front entrance. Patrol found it this morning. Bomb squad already cleared it, turns out it's just a flash drive. Danielle frowned. What's on it? Richards plugged the drive into his computer, and a single file appeared, a video labeled Confessions. He clicked it open, and the screen filled with the image of Brad Marshall sitting in what appeared to be his car. His face was illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard, his expression tense and defiant. "I know what you're trying to do, Chief Warren," Brad's recorded voice began. "You think you're going to tear me down, erase me like I never existed. But you don't know the whole story. You don't know what this place really is." Danielle's jaw tightened as Brad launched into a tirade about the precinct's internal workings, peppered with accusations of corruption and favoritism. The video wasn't just about his grievances, it was a calculated attempt to drag others into his downfall. He named officers, hinted at backdoor deals, and alluded to practices that, if proven true, could shake the precinct to its core. "This isn't just about me," Brad said in the recording, his voice steady despite the clear bitterness in his tone. "If I go down, I'm taking everyone with me." Richards paused the video, his face grim. "This could get ugly." Danielle exhaled slowly. "It already is. He's trying to shift the narrative, paint himself as a victim." Richards leaned back in his chair. "The problem is, some of what he's saying might not be completely off base. We both know there are skeletons in this place." Danielle didn't respond immediately. Instead, she straightened and fixed Richards with a steady gaze. "We deal with the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. If he's telling the truth about anything, we address it. If he's lying, we expose him. But either way, we don't let him dictate the terms." The decision was clear, but the path forward was anything but easy. Danielle knew that pursuing the truth would mean facing resistance not just from Brad but potentially from within her own ranks. It was a dilemma that cut to the heart of her mission. Reforming a system meant dismantling parts of it, and that meant there would be casualties along the way. Meanwhile, Brad wasn't done. From the shadows, he worked to spread his narrative. He leaked parts of his video to sympathetic ears, officers who felt threatened by Danielle's reforms, local reporters eager for a scandal, and even members of the public who saw the police force as inherently corrupt. The story gained traction, and soon, questions about Danielle's leadership began to surface. Critics painted her as overzealous, accusing her of trying to dismantle the force rather than improve it. The pressure mounted, but Danielle refused to waver. She called a department-wide meeting, determined to address the brewing storm head-on. The room was packed, the air heavy with anticipation as she stepped to the front. "I'm sure you've all heard the rumors," she began, her voice steady. "I won't pretend they don't matter. They do. But what matters more is the truth." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on her. Brad Marshall's actions were unacceptable, but they are not the sole reason we're here today. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture that allowed someone like him to believe he could act without consequence. If we're serious about change, we have to face that culture head-on. Danielle's words hung in the air, a challenge and a call to action. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions resolute. Others shifted uncomfortably, their resistance evident. The room wasn't unified, but Danielle hadn't expected it to be. Change was never easy, and she was prepared to weather the storm. Later that evening, as Danielle reviewed reports in her office, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling: "You're playing a dangerous game, Chief. Be careful who you trust." Danielle stared at the screen, her mind racing. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder that the battle she was fighting wasn't just against Brad. It was against a system that resisted change at every turn, a system that would fight tooth and nail to protect itself. She locked her phone and leaned back in her chair, her determination hardening. The stakes were higher than ever, but she wouldn't back down. This wasn't just about Brad Marshall anymore. It was about proving that accountability wasn't just a buzzword, it was a promise. And she intended to keep it. Danielle sat in her office, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting shadows across stacks of reports and folders. The text message still lingered in her mind, its words playing on a loop as she sifted through the evidence compiled against Brad Marshall. Her instincts told her the message wasn't from him. Brad wasn't subtle enough for veiled threats. This was from someone else, someone who wanted her to feel the pressure. But if they thought intimidation would slow her down, they were mistaken. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Captain Richards stepped inside, his expression grim. "Chief, we've got another situation," he said, his voice low. "Brad's video is spreading. A local news outlet picked it up, and it's causing a stir. They're calling it a whistleblower expose, painting him as some kind of hero taking on corruption." Danielle exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. "What's the reaction inside the precinct?" "Mixed," Richards admitted. "Some officers are standing with you, but others, well, you know how it is. They're scared of what might come out, even if they're not guilty of anything. And then there are the ones who are guilty." Danielle nodded, her expression hardening. "Brad's banking on fear and division to protect himself. It's classic deflection. If he can make enough noise, he thinks we'll back off." Richards hesitated. "But what if some of what he's saying is true? What if there are things buried here that we haven't uncovered yet?" "That's exactly why we can't let him dictate the terms," Danielle said firmly. "If there's corruption, we expose it. If there's wrongdoing, we address it. But we do it on our terms, not his." Richard studied her for a moment before nodding. "You're right. As always." He started to leave but paused at the door. "Be careful, Chief. The kind of enemies you're making don't play fair." Danielle watched him go, the weight of his words settling over her. She knew the risks, but retreat wasn't an option. This was bigger than her, bigger than Brad. It was about changing a culture that had thrived on silence and complicity for far too long. Meanwhile, Brad was busy escalating his campaign. He had gathered a small group of sympathetic officers at a bar just outside the city, their hushed conversations charged with anger and frustration. "I'm telling you," Brad said, leaning across the table, "she's not here to fix the system. She's here to tear it down. And if we let her, none of us are safe." One of the officers, a younger man named Davis, shifted uncomfortably. "But isn't she right about some things? I mean, we've all seen stuff that shouldn't have happened." Brad shot him a withering look. "That's not the point. The point is, she's using me as a scapegoat to make herself look good. If she gets her way, she'll throw us all under the bus just to prove a point." Another officer, older and more seasoned, nodded in agreement. "He's right. These reformers don't care about the job. They just want headlines." Brad leaned back, a smug grin spreading across his face. He could feel the tide turning in his favor, the cracks forming in the solidarity Danielle had worked so hard to build. Back at the precinct, Danielle gathered her core team, Richards, Morales, and Taylor, for a late-night strategy session. The mood was tense but focused, the group determined to push through the chaos Brad had unleashed. "We need to control the narrative," Danielle began, her tone measured but firm. "Right now, Brad's video is the only story people are hearing. We need to tell the truth, not just about him, but about what we're trying to build here." Taylor nodded. "We could hold a press conference, lay out the facts." Danielle shook her head. "Not yet. We don't have enough. If we go public now, it'll look like damage control. We need to strengthen our case first." Morales spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Chief, I've been going through some of the older records, and there's stuff in there. Stuff that could back up some of what Brad's saying." Danielle's gaze sharpened. "What kind of stuff?" "Disciplinary actions that were buried, complaints that disappeared. It's not widespread, but it's there. If we don't address it, it's going to blow up in our faces." Danielle took a deep breath, her mind racing. Then we address it, she said finally. We don't bury it, we don't spin it. We own it. If we're going to rebuild trust, we have to start by being honest. Richards nodded in agreement. It's risky, but it's the right move. The meeting ended on a determined note, but Danielle knew the hardest part was still ahead. As she walked back to her office, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail from an unknown number. She hesitated before pressing play. Chief Warren, the voice began, low and unrecognizable. You're making a lot of enemies. If you're smart, you'll walk away before it's too late. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she didn't delete the message. Instead, she forwarded it to Richards with a simple note, keep this on file. The next morning, Danielle held a department-wide briefing. The room was packed, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. She stood at the front, her posture straight, her gaze steady. I'm not here to sugarcoat anything, she began. This department has a history, one that includes incredible service and dedication, but also mistakes. Some of those mistakes were small. Others were significant. And it's time we faced them. Her words hung in the air, met with a mixture of silence and murmurs. I know some of you are scared, she continued. Scared of what might come out, scared of what it means for your careers. But this isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. If we're going to move forward, we have to start by being honest about where we've been. One officer stood, his expression conflicted. Chief, what about the people who've done everything right? The ones who've followed the rules and still get painted with the same brush. Danielle met his gaze. You're right. That's not fair. And that's why this process isn't about blame, it's about rebuilding trust. But we can't rebuild if we don't acknowledge the cracks in the foundation. As the briefing ended, Danielle could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. She had planted the seeds of change, even if the ground was still rocky. But as she returned to her office, her thoughts turned to Brad. He was still out there, still plotting, and she knew he wasn't done. The question wasn't if he would make another move, it was when. And Danielle was ready. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, determined to see her mission through to the end. The precinct was quieter than usual, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind that carried tension in the air, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Danielle sat in her office, her eyes fixed on the report in front of her. It was the latest update from Morales, a detailed list of discrepancies in old case files, cases that Brad had referenced in his video. While some were legitimate complaints, others were vague or outright fabricated. The work of untangling fact from fiction was exhaustive, but Danielle knew it was necessary. A knock at the door broke her concentration. Richards entered, his expression more concerned than usual. Chief, he began, shutting the door behind him. We've got a situation. Danielle set the report aside and gestured for him to continue. Brad stirring the pot again, Richards said, crossing his arms. He's been in contact with a local journalist, someone hungry for a headline. They're planning a piece that's going to air tonight. From what I've heard, it's bad. Danielle's jaw tightened. How bad? Richards exhaled sharply. They're spinning him as a whistleblower, a victim of department politics. He's claiming you're targeting him to cover up larger issues. Danielle leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. He's weaponizing the truth, she said after a moment. Using just enough fact to make his lies believable. Exactly, Richard said. And with the way the public's been responding to his video, this could gain traction. Danielle stood, her hands resting on the desk. Then we need to respond before it airs. Get me the contact information for that journalist. If they're worth their salt, they'll want both sides of the story. Richards nodded and left the room. Danielle stared out the window, her reflection superimposed against the city skyline. Brad was relentless, but so was she. This was no longer just about the precinct or even her reputation, it was about the integrity of everything she was trying to build. A few hours later, Danielle was on the phone with the journalist, a young woman named Kara Simmons. Simmons's voice was sharp, her questions pointed, but Danielle held her ground, refusing to let the narrative slip away. "Chief Warren," Simmons said, her tone laced with skepticism, "Brad Marshall has provided documents and testimony that suggest systemic corruption within your department. How do you respond to that?" "I respond with transparency," Danielle said firmly. "If there's corruption, we'll uncover it. But Brad Marshall is not a whistleblower, he's a man trying to escape accountability. His actions aren't about exposing the truth, they're about deflecting from his own misconduct." Simmons hesitated. "You're saying his accusations have no merit?" "I'm saying some of what he's brought up is worth examining, and we are examining it," Danielle replied. "But his narrative is designed to create chaos, not solutions. The real question is why he's choosing to air these grievances now, after years of silence." Simmons paused, clearly considering Danielle's words. "Do you have evidence to back up your claims against him?" "We do," Danielle said. "And when the investigation is complete, we'll make that evidence public. But I'll also say this, Brad Marshall isn't just fighting me, he's fighting a system that no longer tolerates the behavior he's built his career on. That's the real story here." The conversation ended on a tense note, but Danielle felt a flicker of hope. Simmons hadn't promised to change her angle, but she had listened, and sometimes that was enough. As the day wore on, the precinct remained a hive of activity. Morales and Taylor worked tirelessly to comb through records, their determination evident in the lines etched into their faces. Danielle made rounds, checking in with officers and staff, reinforcing the sense of purpose she had been cultivating since her arrival. "Chief," Morales said as Danielle stopped by his desk. "I found something." She leaned over the desk as Morales pulled up a file on his computer. It was an internal memo from several years prior, detailing complaints against Brad that had mysteriously disappeared from his record. The memo included names of those involved in covering up the incidents, names that sent a chill down Danielle's spine. "This is it," Morales said. "Proof that Brad wasn't acting alone." Danielle's mind raced. This was bigger than Brad. The network of complicity extended beyond him, implicating individuals who were still active in the department. Exposing this would mean more than just holding Brad accountable, it would mean dismantling a system that had protected him. She straightened and met Morales's gaze. "Good work. Make sure this is secure. We'll need it soon." Later that evening, Danielle gathered her core team for another meeting. The mood was tense but focused, the gravity of their task evident. "We've got enough to counter Brad's claims," Danielle began. "But this isn't just about him anymore. The memo Morales found confirms what we've suspected, there's a network of protection that's allowed people like Brad to operate unchecked." Richards nodded. "And taking them down won't be easy. Some of these people have been here for decades. They've got connections." "I know," Danielle said. "But we're not backing down. This isn't just about cleaning up the past, it's about ensuring this department has a future." Taylor spoke up, his voice steady. "What's the plan?" "We go public," Danielle said. "Not just with the evidence against Brad, but with the broader findings. We own our mistakes and commit to fixing them. It's risky, but it's the only way to rebuild trust." The room was silent for a moment before Richard spoke. "It's bold, Chief. But it's the right move." As the meeting ended, Danielle felt a renewed sense of determination. The path ahead was treacherous, but she wasn't walking it alone. Meanwhile, Brad watched the news from a motel room, his expression dark. The piece hadn't gone entirely in his favor. Simmons had included Danielle's perspective, casting doubt on Brad's claims. The public reaction was mixed, but Brad knew the tide was turning against him. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with desperation. If he couldn't control the narrative, he would have to escalate. Back at the precinct, Danielle prepared for the next phase. The pieces were falling into place, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Brad was still out there, and she could feel the storm brewing. Whatever his next move was, she would be ready. The final confrontation unfolded in a way that no one could have anticipated. As Danielle stood in front of the press, the weight of her mission pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to waver. Her decision to go public with the department's flaws was not easy, but it was necessary. The evidence against Brad Marshall was damning, but it was the network of protection around him that painted a far more troubling picture. Accountability isn't just a buzzword, Danielle told the reporters. Her voice was calm but firm, her presence commanding. It's a commitment to transparency, even when it's uncomfortable. The actions of certain individuals in this department have betrayed the trust of the community, and it's my responsibility to ensure that betrayal ends here. She outlined the steps the department was taking to address past grievances, including independent investigations into every claim Brad had made. She didn't shy away from admitting the department's failures, but she also made it clear that the changes underway were irreversible. The press conference was a gamble, but it worked. Public opinion began to shift, and Danielle's integrity became the story. Meanwhile, Brad had gone into hiding, his desperation mounting. His attempt to frame himself as a whistleblower had backfired. The evidence Danielle's team uncovered not only discredited his claims but also implicated him in a series of misconduct cases that spanned years. He became a pariah, even among those who had once supported him. In the end, Brad was arrested for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. As he was led away in handcuffs, his once cocky demeanor was replaced by a hollow, defeated expression. He had gambled everything and lost. The ripple effect of Brad's downfall was profound. Several high-ranking officers who had protected him were forced to resign or face criminal charges. The department underwent a complete overhaul, with Danielle spearheading the reforms. She brought in new leadership, diversified the ranks, and implemented policies that prioritized accountability and community engagement. For Danielle, the victory was bittersweet. She had succeeded in exposing corruption and setting the department on a better path, but it had come at a cost. The process had been grueling, and she knew the battle for meaningful change was far from over. But as she walked through the precinct, the respect in the eyes of her officers was palpable. She had earned their trust not through authority, but through her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Richards remained by her side, his loyalty and pragmatism invaluable throughout the ordeal. "You did it, Chief," he said one evening as they reviewed the latest reforms. "We did it," Danielle corrected, a rare smile gracing her lips. "But there's still more to do." Morales and Taylor also thrived under Danielle's leadership. Their dedication to justice and willingness to embrace change made them natural leaders in the new era of the department. Together, they worked to repair the fractured relationship between the precinct and the community it served. Brad's fate served as a cautionary tale for those who had once operated like him. Stripped of his badge, his reputation in tatters, he faced years of legal battles and the realization that his actions had not only ruined his career but also the lives of those he had harmed along the way. For Danielle, the story wasn't about personal vindication. It was about something bigger, proving that change was possible, even in a system designed to resist it. As she stood in her office, looking out over the city, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of her grandmother Evelyn's words, the lessons that had shaped her life: respect isn't given. It's taken, fought for, and earned. Evelyn would have been proud. The precinct thrived under Danielle's continued leadership. Crime rates dropped, trust between officers and the community improved, and the department became a model for reform. Danielle's journey from humiliation to triumph was a testament to resilience and the power of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Now, as we reflect on this story, what lessons can we take away? Danielle's fight wasn't just about justice, it was about courage, integrity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. How often do we avoid accountability, not just in institutions, but in our own lives? And what could we achieve if we had the bravery to face those truths head-on? What do you think of Danielle's journey? Did her unwavering stance inspire you? Or did Brad's downfall serve as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked power? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Thank you for watching Tales of Twist. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping narratives like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit that like button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story with a twist that will leave you thinking. Until next time, stay curious, and always question what's beneath the surface.